Let's cut straight to the chase. The Lancia Stratos is one of the most outrageous, deranged cars ever sold to the public. But unleashing such an unhinged car on consumers wasn't its primary purpose, and in fact the cars sat around unsold for years after they were built. The real purpose of the Stratos was to go rallying, and it did that like no car before or since. It is, deservedly, a legend, and the way that it does its thing is so singular that it will make an unforgettable impression on anyone who ever interacts with one, no matter how many other special cars they've experienced.
Continuiamo in italiano allora! In Christ, we're gonna die.
The Stratos story starts in the 1950s. By 1955, Lancia had developed 4 specialized sports cars and the world's most advanced Grand Prix car in barely more than 3 years, something they did effectively without regard to cost. Meanwhile, Lancia's commercial vehicle and passenger car divisions were losing money, and the Lancia family had had enough. The entire Grand Prix operation, including cars, spare parts, and even engineers, was handed over to Ferrari in the middle of the racing season, and the Lancia family sold a majority stake of the company to cement magnate Carlo Pezzenti. With Lancia officially out of racing, various private groups picked up the torch, and by the early 60s, Flavias were appearing in rallies. These were joined by their little brothers, the Fulvias, in 1965, and they were even more effective. The same year, the most active of the private racing teams, HF Squadra Corse, was folded into Lancia to become their official racing entity. After a decade of absence, Lancia was off to the races again. HF Squadra Corse had only been founded 2 years earlier in 1963 by Cesare Fiorio, the 23-year-old son of Lancia marketing executive Sandro Fiorio. Cesare would lead Lancia's racing efforts over the next 2 decades, all the way from the Fulvia through the Delta Integrale, including the Stratos. The second half of the 60s went very well for Lancia's race team, with the Fulvias taking over completely and winning a number of rallies, including an overall victory at the 1967 Tour de Corse by Sandro Munari, who would later become the most iconic Stratos pilot. Class wins in road racing were not atypical either, including the Daytona 24 Hours, Targa Florio, and Monza 1000 kilometers. By the start of the 70s, the Fulvia had reached the limit of its development, and a host of other cars were starting to eclipse it, including the Renault Alpine A110 and Porsche 911, both of which had their engines behind rather than in front of their occupants. The combination of not being able to extract more from the Fulvia and the desire for a rear-wheel drive car shaped Lancia's earliest visions for an all-new rally car. It would be designed from the ground up to meet upcoming Group 4 competition regulations and be agile and tough enough to excel in both technical rallies with lots of tarmac and punishing events over rough terrain such as the East African Safari Rally and Greece's Acropolis Rally. More or less by coincidence, the coach builder Bertone, always pushing the limits of styling and engineering, were working on an outrageous concept car that was closer to Lancia's needs than anything Lancia had on the drawing board. Called the Stratos Zero, it was mid-engined and rear-wheel drive and just happened to be powered by a Lancia Fulvia powertrain. Unveiled in November of 1970 at the Turin Motor Show, it was a shocking visual statement that Bertone hoped would draw Lancia away from their established manufacturing relationship with Pininfarina. Lancia was as surprised as anyone when the Stratos Zero appeared, and a couple months after the Turin show they contacted Nuccio Bertone and asked to see it up close. He was happy to oblige, driving the fully functional car across Turin from Bertone's studio to Lancia's headquarters, where it impressed Lancia executives enough for them to send a contract to develop what would become the production Stratos a few weeks later in February of 1971. Just 9 months later, again at the Turin Motor Show, Bertone displayed the result of this contract, the new Stratos HF concept, which looked a lot more plausible as a car than the Zero, and also surprisingly close to the final Stratos. It was developed primarily by Bertone, with Marcello Gandini designing both the chassis and the body. Lancia had neither the budget nor the staff to develop and build the car entirely in-house, so Cesare Fiorio and other senior Lancia men surveyed their engineers, mechanics, and rally drivers to figure out what their ultimate rally car should look like, and then pass the results on to Bertone. One of the key innovations of the Stratos was the way that Lancia interpreted the rules. The car was built specifically for Group 4, a category called Special Grand Touring Cars. Rather than being a tuned-up version of a regular production Group 3 GT car like most of the Group 4 cars, the Stratos was designed from the ground up for the more permissive Group 4 rules, and thus only 500 would need to be built. This meant that Lancia could race a car that was designed specifically for rallying instead of being derived from a regular production car like a Ford Escort or Fiat 124. Every aspect of the Stratos' design reflects its mission to win rallies. It has a short wheelbase, wide track, and short upturned overhangs to provide clearance when sliding sideways by roadside rocks and berms, which together with the compact mid-engined powertrain over the driven wheels make the car incredibly agile. Its torsional rigidity is comparable to that of a Formula 1 car from the same era, and the top of the rear struts mount to beefy turrets that look more than up to the task of surviving thousands of jumps from Sweden to Nairobi. The engine is cradled in a robust steel cage, the top part of which is bolted on so that it can be quickly detached to access or remove the engine, which highlights the next rally car wishlist item: accessibility. Lamborghini Miura-style front and rear clamshells can easily be swapped mid-rally in case of damage, and also provide great access to the driveline and suspension, which is particularly helpful because Lancia's mechanics and drivers also requested fully adjustable suspension to accommodate driver preferences and varying conditions. Lancia did not have an engine suitable for this car, and Bertone, while hurriedly building the mock-up, dropped in a Ferrari V6 with transaxle that they had lying around. Within a month of Lancia's engineers sending their requirements to Bertone, they visited Ferrari to ask about using the 65-degree V6 and 5-speed transmission from the 246 Dino. Enzo was enthusiastic, and was even more so after seeing the Stratos HF at Turin, but he was only in charge of Ferrari's racing operation at this point. Fiat had taken control of Ferrari's road car production in 1969 and had installed their own managers, who would ultimately have to okay Lancia's request for 500 powertrains. This approval finally arrived in December of 1972, more than 18 months after the first request. Even so, contracts were not complete for another 3 months, and Lancia's general manager wasn't confident enough in Ferrari to give Bertone the go-ahead to make Stratos chassis and bodies until the end of 1973. Outside of the car itself, there were plenty of other problems. Lancia had been losing large sums of money, and Fiat acquired the company in 1969, which resulted in jostling for control within the company and the installation of Fiat loyalists. Money was tight, and on top of that, the first fuel crisis hit. Anxious to show results of the Stratos project in this atmosphere of chaos, Fiorio debuted the car in racing before it was really ready in November of 1972 at the Tour de Corse, where the rear suspension broke in unusually harsh conditions. This feat was repeated the following month at a rally in Spain, and it was not until April of 1973 at the Firestone Rally that the car scored its first victory, driven, naturally, by Sandro Munari. Other successes followed in 1973, including a surprise second-place finish at the Targa Florio after the big 12-cylinder Ferraris and Alfa Romeos all failed to finish. In September, the Stratos scored its first major win at the grueling 9-day-long Tour de France, again driven by Munari. Throughout this period, the car raced in Group 5 as a prototype because the hundreds of production cars needed for homologation had not yet been built. The Stratos was finally homologated on the 1st of October 1974, largely because of Fiorio's desperation. Strikes had slowed production, and fewer than half of the required cars had been built when Fiorio wrote to governing bodies claiming that all of the homologation cars were finished. They duly sent out FIA inspector Paul Frere, who looked around briefly and agreed that whatever had been done was good enough, and the papers were issued.
You say just out this year?
Yes, we homologate the Stratos in Group 4 from the 1st October.
The very next day, at Lancia's home rally of San Remo, the cars were racing, and Munari went on to score the Stratos' first of many wins as a homologated Group 4 car. Lancia threw together challenges for each of the 3 remaining rounds in the championship and went on to win it, despite the Stratos not even being homologated until October. This was the first of 3 World Rally Championships that the Stratos won. It also won 3 European Rally titles and took 3 pilots to driver championships. In all, the Stratos won 18 World Championship rallies, including the Monte Carlo Rally 4 times, countless other smaller events, and also scored outright wins in the Targa Florio and Tour de France. Remarkably, these tallies could have been much higher. 24-valve and turbocharged versions of the Stratos were still being refined when Lancia's parent company, Fiat, decided that they wanted their own name capturing the glory of international competition. Fiat's and Lancia's racing teams were merged into a single entity at the end of 1976, and the focus switched to Fiat's also superb but much more conventional 131. The road-going Stratos, the Stradale, was built with little enthusiasm and sold with even less success. It existed so that the race cars were legal to compete, and outside of racing, Lancia marketed the car little and didn't even bother to certify it for certain European markets, let alone the lucrative US market. All in, more than 490 were built, but new examples remained unsold into 1979, 4 years after production had ended. The car was expensive, but not wildly so, about the same price as a Porsche 911S or Alfa Romeo Montreal, and less than either a Ferrari 308 GT4 or a Lamborghini Urraco. Even a short drive in the Stratos reveals why its commercial appeal was limited in period. Simply put, it is clinically insane. It assaults you with its single-minded focus on winning rallies, and as it turns out, most consumers of expensive cars in the 70s were not interested in being assaulted. Me, however, I'm interested.
I've never driven any car like this. I don't have the words, which is very unusual for me because I always have words, but holy fucking shit.
As soon as the car is rolling, even at a walking pace, you are blown away by the steering. It's incredibly light, but also communicative, and so responsive. The car darts left and right instinctively, and you learn to grip the steering wheel lightly and let it dance in your hands. There's a natural feel to it that immediately inspired my confidence and somehow felt familiar, almost like the car wasn't there at all. I fell in love immediately. The intense experience promised by this car is at odds with a strangely practical stripe in the Stratos' character. The visibility out the front is wild. The windscreen curves sharply around you in a way that makes you feel like you're sitting inside of a helmet, while the front of the car slopes down so sharply that you can't really see any cars through the windscreen, just road. The clutch is friendly and easy to modulate, and the gear change is somehow less effort and smoother than a 246, even though it's basically the same hardware. The long travel rally suspension rides surprisingly comfortably, while the short wheelbase and overhangs mean that you can fly into driveways in a way that would make a supercar driver cringe so hard that they shatter their teeth. The trunk is usefully shaped and spacious, but hot, while one of the famous door pockets, which can indeed fit a helmet, swallowed the entire contents of my backpack. The engine is tractable at all RPMs, and aside from a heavy throttle which makes pulling away smoothly a little tricky, the light control forces and compact dimensions make maneuvering in town a cinch. In our case, town means Monte Carlo, and what better town in which to maneuver a Stratos given all its Monte Carlo rally wins? Out on the open road, however, the true character of the Stratos emerges, and it turns out the car is absolutely batshit. I've never experienced any car remotely close to anything like this one. After I finished my first spirited drive in the Stratos, I was overwhelmed by emotions, but not actual coherent thoughts or impressions. The only thing in my head was colors and noise. My hands were shaking, I was out of breath, and for some reason I was simultaneously laughing and on the verge of sobbing. I think it was relief that I had not died, but I'm still not really sure. Journalist Carl Ludvigsen owned a yellow Stratos and wrote that a spirited drive in it made his hands shake too, so there's that, I guess. Like any Ferrari power plant, the Stratos engine is magic, 7,800 RPM. The throttle response is magnificent, and nearly any throttle input causes the car to explode forward with a brutality that makes me incredulous that it's the same engine as a 246, but that's what 2,150 pounds does. This is accompanied by an explosion of mechanical sounds, slobbery induction noises, and a fantastic exhaust roar, all of which are comprehensively pornographic where they're on or off the throttle. In fact, trailing throttle is perhaps the greatest treat. Raw, nasty, beastly stuff that makes this one of the best sounding cars I have ever experienced. The gearbox is a pleasure to use with well-defined gates, good synchromesh, pleasing slickness, and reasonable effort. It is probably the least disorienting part of the car, even if it is a dogleg shift pattern. Which brings us to the chassis, the part of the Stratos that makes it so different from any other car. There is an inherent feeling of instability to it which makes it change direction like nothing else. And it does this based on steering input, braking input, throttle input, and sometimes it seems like no input at all. The car dances over the road in a way that feels hyperactive and requires quick yet smooth and measured reactions from the driver. The car is alive in your hands and it is pissed. Under heavy braking, the car darts this way and that based on who really knows. How many cigarettes the man who laid down the asphalt had that day? The chassis feels like barely contained chaos, and that is the feeling that comes with driving this car quickly. It feels like you are always on the very outer edge of being in control. It is very definitely a professional-grade tool for professional-grade drivers with professional-grade reflexes. If all of this sounds rather bad, I have to correct that impression because somehow it's actually good. Really good. There is a weightlessness and lack of inertia to the entire car that elevates the driver's alertness to the highest possible level. The experience is singular because the car is difficult to read and therefore requires constant study from the inquisitive driver. Sandro Munari said that you could go around the same corner twice and the car would react differently each time. He also said that if you did a stage in 2 minutes, it felt like the car had so much capability that you could have done it in 1 minute and 40 seconds if only you had the skill to extract that from the car. You always feel like the car is more capable than you are, and as a driving enthusiast, chasing mastery of this car is intoxicating. Addictive even, but not in a benign way like chocolate-covered almonds, more like drugs. In a this will kill you, but it'll be awesome sort of way. These driving impressions highlight that the Lancia Stratos should probably be a controlled substance. Used by professionals, it's highly effective. Used recklessly, it is lethal. And for the rest of us, dabble occasionally, ideally with adult supervision, and it will rock your world. The intensity of the Stratos experience is the direct result of its mission. The idea of designing a car from the ground up specifically to rally lasted for a surprisingly short time, barely more than a decade, and it began with this car. It genuinely redefined what the public could expect a performance car to do and transformed rallying into a mainstream activity in the process. It made rallying not just an activity where surviving stages was required to win, but also physics-defying pace. To watch a Stratos at speed is one of life's great pleasures for a car enthusiast, something which is all the more romantic because the car was retired at its prime, almost tragically, by forces that had nothing to do with how good a car it was. But while it was racing, it was an absolute force, and thankfully the rules required hundreds of these things to be made. Over the decades, this has allowed many mortals to experience one of the most exciting cars ever made, one which just happened to change the landscape of motorsport, and my psyche, forever.
So I'm about to have a reaction. Holy shit. I've never driven any car like this. I don't have the words, which is very unusual for me because I always have words. But holy fucking shit. How have I not heard about this car before, or what an insane, wild ride it is. It's absolutely insane. I'm fucking beside myself. This car is, everything else sucks. Unless you want to, live, I guess. But other than that, yeah, everything else fucking sucks with this car. Unless you want to live.